I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
What are we looking at today, Rob?
We're looking at part of a really, really big and extremely important work.
Yeah, I think the volume, the copy that I have, which is a Taiwanese copy, is 8 volumes, including some annotation and things like that. What is it called?
The English translation is The Records of the Grand Historian, Shiji.
Shiji.
And it is by Sima Qian.
And Sima Qian, we just should point out here, his family name is Sima, and his given name is Qian.
Which is weird.
Yeah, strange in Chinese context.
I should say weird. It's unusual. There aren't a lot of family names with 2 syllables.
Exactly, yeah.
Let's give some background before we dive into the story we're going to be talking about.
Okay.
Sima Qian is 145 to, I believe, something like 86 BC, so Han Dynasty era. And
this is under the reign of Han Wudi, who,
yes,
in the Han Dynasty, he's the emperor who's kind of like a big deal.
Yeah, yeah. And a couple of facts. One, it's called The Records of the Grand Historian, but actually Sima Qian's court title was astrologer.
Mm-hmm. And those are related, right? Like
yes.
Historian and astrologer, they're kind of the same. There's not really a distinction.
Sima Tan's father was also a court astrologer.
Sima Qian's father, Sima Tan.
Sima Tan, yes. Was also a court astrologer who's... And as in this position, what you did was you studied the heavens and made sure that the kingdom's calendars had the right days for things like sacrifices and ritual ceremonies.
And you wrote down what happened, right? So you can easily see how what started out as a position as the court astrologer evolved into historian.
Right. So the work that we have was begun by the father, Sima Tan. And the introduction to the Records of the Grand Historian, Sima Qian has this long, tearful soliloquy from his father, summoning him to the great work of compiling these histories of the ancient dynasties.
So it's not even clear how much of this work is Sima Qian's and
yes.
how much of it is Sima Tan's.
Yeah.
Right?
But anyway, the way it's presented is a history, essentially, of extremely important people and events up to Sima Qian's time.
Yeah, it's a series of biographies from the very beginning of Chinese history to the present, essentially, or very close to the present.
There's some discussion among us moderns whether or not it's a history or really whether it's more like just literature.
Yeah.
In the same way that we talk about Homer. Perhaps not exactly the same way.
Right,
but for many, many, many generations in Greece, the Iliad in particular was
used as a historical text.
Yeah, practically holy writ. You would settle political arguments using details in the Iliad. Like, well, clearly this group has rite of passage here because it says in Homer that da-da-da.
So I think it's great that we keep these kinds of genre discussions in mind as we dive into this.
Yeah.
One fun fact I want to include about Sima Qian is, so for some reason, Han Wudi, Emperor Wu, he was not too happy with something Sima Qian did or said, and so he had him ordered castrated. Now, to be ordered castrated in classical China was actually more of a death sentence. You weren't really supposed to allow yourself to be castrated. You were supposed to just kill yourself at that point. Sima Qian did not do that. Sima Qian valued, the way he represents it at least, he wanted to finish his father's task that his father had started him on. And so he took the incredibly embarrassing punishment of being castrated and finished the history. And there's this interesting kind of thing. He took this punishment which doesn't allow him to propagate himself. But he and his narrative, his history, has been propagated throughout Chinese history. It's really the most it's the beginning of narrative in China. I mean, there's some stuff going on before that, but it's all, no one reads it. And I mean, like, people still today know the Shiji, and it's quite beautifully written.
It is. And you put this really, really well. It's not the beginning of what we think of as narrative in general, but it is the beginning of a certain kind of narrative. An expert on some of the classical Chinese texts we talk about, Stephen Durant, who hopefully will be on a podcast at some point, made the point a while ago that there is a moment in Sima Qian, I believe it is in the introduction, it could be a little later, when he says, I essentially went out wandering, looking for the truth of these stories and compiling accounts of the nation, the kingdom. Mm-hmm. And Durant points out this is the first time we have the introduction of the author's first-person pronoun. I went and did this. It's all over Herodotus.
Right.
But this is the first time in Chinese narrative history when this happens. Mm-hmm. There are older texts like the Zuozhuan, where there are kind of stories we would think of as narratives, but nothing like on this scale. In fact, I'm not even sure I like answering the question, is it history or literature? Because frankly, it's just so, I'm going to say fun to read. The section we're going to talk about today in particular, the biography of Xiang Yu, mm-hmm. frankly reads like Shakespeare. Sima Qian is known for these dramatic scene settings and things like that really make this a very accessible work.
We talked about nailing things down in the Zhuangzi, how we're not supposed
and that
to
didn't
nail
go well.
Down. So I think maybe we should just try and not nail this down. Let's just dive right in.
Let's dive in.
You mentioned the name of the guy who we're talking about. What is it again?
Xiang Yu.
Xiang Yu. And tell us a little about Xiang Yu.
So the biography of Xiang Yu, which is what we're talking about, is long. And I think the English translation is something
like 30 pages. Yeah.
Which, for text from this era, is enormous. That would be like having a biography of 1,000 pages now. Yeah. It's unreal. His uncle was Xiangyang, who was a general in the kingdom of Chu, which in the period this is written was one of the major powers in the empire.
And that's in kind of what today would be central China, but then was regarded as southern.
Yeah, yeah. So Lee, tell us a little bit about the sort of the historical setting of the biography of Xiang Yu.
So Xiang Yu appears in 232 BCE, and he is a scion of a Chu military family. And he appears right around the time that China is first politically unified. Before, it had been this collection of kind of disparate states that shared similar cultures, but didn't really kind of get along and were always warring. There was an empire, but it didn't really function. This guy named Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin, is the first guy to unify all that. Now, he is a bit kind of a jerk. He, not to get too technical or anything about it.
Lee likes using very technical language.
I was going to use some other language, but the iTunes store wouldn't allow me to. Anyways, he's a jerk, and his rule lasts, but not beyond his lifetime. His dynasty essentially collapses as fairly shortly after he dies. And so Xiang Yu and his family are fairly powerful in their region, Chu, when this collapse happens. And so that picks up on the story of Xiang Yu, which...
Okay. So I'm not going to try to summarize the whole story because it's just full of tons of little details.
And there's too many ins and outs.
There's too many ins and outs. But it's essentially the rise and fall of Xiang Yu, who amounts to a kind of a military genius. His uncle, Xiang Liang, essentially takes over the kingdom of Wu. He does it through fairly subtle statecraft, but still does it. And eventually gets himself killed. Xiang Yu steps up. And again, through a series of circumstances, takes the generalship himself, is immensely powerful.
He becomes essentially a military dictator, right?
Yes, he does. But insists towards the end of the story that actually heaven is not on his side. That Tian...
He's quite smart, and he's quite good at generalship, but he just keeps getting bad luck.
Yeah, and so he asserts towards the end of the story that heaven has abandoned him. He's not actually the chosen of heaven. And in an extremely dramatic moment, because there's a price put out on his head, he defies the generals who are chasing him and says, "Do you want my head? Fine." And he slits his own throat.
He cuts off his own head, actually.
I read just slits his own throat, but it could be, depending on how you translate it.
Yeah. And
that's the end.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a rise and fall of a sort of a military dictator kind of story.
And would you say it's, in kind of Western literary terms, would you call it a tragedy?
I think I would. And it's interesting. It's an interesting question, because one of the things that classical tragedy, especially Greek, involves is a flaw, a heroic flaw, a tragic flaw.
I was looking, and as a kind of Western trained literary guy, I was looking for the tragic flaw. Does he have a tragic flaw?
I don't see one. What is interesting is this notion that he's been abandoned by heaven.
Yeah.
He says this, and we don't have conversations from the gods or anything like that in the story.
It's not like Greek gods on Olympus or anything.
No, they're not debating about it. But Lee's right in that there is this... He does have a number of setbacks, sometimes peculiar ones. Like, there will be sections where suddenly the weather clouds up. Holy cow, where did that come from? Now the whole battle's thrown off.
Could we say that his tragic flaw is to not be favored by heaven or to not be lucky?
It could be.
He has some flaws, right? Like,
absolutely.
He doesn't really try to study these things that he really should be studying. He doesn't, like, there are times that he makes stupid mistakes and everybody around him is like, no, you should be doing this. And he, like, kind of hangs back and doesn't do it.
Mm-hmm. But what's interesting about the abandoned by heaven angle of the story is it does make it read a little more like something like Macbeth, where one of the dramatic points in Macbeth is there's this prophecy hanging over the piece, or even Oedipus Rex. Is this going to happen? If it does, how? Who's going to do this? So I don't know that I see a tragic flaw in the classical sense, but there is this sense of the hero not being in control of his own destiny.
You connected it with Macbeth, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And, or even something, even the Iliad has this notion of Achilles. He has a weakness. There's something that will destroy him. The gods have ordained.
Yeah. You connected it with Oedipus Rex too.
There's something similar between all of them. A lot of the drama comes from this.
Just lingering over this whole thing is this issue of prophecy.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's really the right word here, but definitely kind of like fate, I guess, would be the Chinese word.
So the section we're going to talk about is one just after the death of Xiang Liang, who was Xiang Yu's uncle.
He was sort of a mentor figure. We've mentioned him. He kind of trained Xiang Yu in the arts, the military arts.
Yeah. So one of Xiang Liang's advisors, Song Yi, sees him becoming complacent and says, listen, you can't do this. Your troops are getting lazy. You got to do something with them. He basically says, you don't know what you're talking about, and gets himself killed. Song Yi takes over, and at some point, because they're dealing still with Qin Kingdom troops, and Xiang Yu says to him, listen, they're just on the other side of the river. We can go over there, take him out. We can join forces with Zhao. It'll be done. And Song Yi says, now hang on a second. Let's let Qin go ahead and attack Zhao all by themselves. It'll weaken him. We show up and we just knock him out real easy. Xiang Yu's a little dubious about this. And then Song Yi decides to send his son to the kingdom of Qin as an ambassador and celebrates his departure with a huge booze fest, essentially. And Xiang Yu, while this is going on, has a short monologue, which I'll go ahead and read the English translation here. And here's how it goes. This is how it's introduced. The day was cold. A heavy rain was falling, and the soldiers were chilled and starving. We joined forces for the purposes of attacking Qin, Xiang Yu declared. But instead, we have sat here all this time without advancing. The year is lean, the people are poor, and our men eat nothing but taro root and pulse. We have no provisions for our army, and yet Song Yi holds a great drinking party. He will not lead the troops across the river, so that we may live off the food of Zhao, and join forces with Zhao in attacking Qin. But instead, he tells us to take advantage of Qin's weakness. Now, if Qin, in all her strength, attacks the newly founded state of Zhao, she is sure to be powerful enough to defeat Zhao. And if Zhao is defeated and Qin is left as strong as ever, what sort of weakness will there be for us to take advantage of? Our troops were only lately defeated, and the king sits uneasy on his throne. Yet all the men within our borders are swept up together under Song Yi's sole command, so that the entire safety of our state depends upon this one move. Now he takes no thought for our soldiers, but attends only to his personal affairs. He is a traitor to the altars of our soil and grain. And then shortly after this, or actually I guess the next morning, he goes in and cuts Song Yi's head off.
He just walks right into his
Walks
tent.
in the tent, cuts his head off.
And immediately after that, if I remember correctly, all of Song Yi's like generals and whatnot, they all kind of like are just destroyed. I mean, not destroyed, but just kind of demolished by how crazy Xiang Yu is. And so they prostrate themselves on the ground and go, "Oh, we will serve you because you are a crazy mofo."
Yeah, there's that. And there's also Xiang Yu said, "Look, I did this under command of the emperor, okay?"
But he made that up, right? He didn't actually
totally made that up. It is possible the courtiers know he's making this up, the other generals, but...
It's an excuse, though, right?
Yeah, it is. Now, why are we doing this passage? Of all the possible passages...
Yeah, Rob, why are we doing
this passage? This was my favorite. I mean, there are other really crazy moments, too, which we could talk about.
What makes it your favorite?
What makes it my favorite is that up to this point, Xiang Yu does not say anything. He's essentially his uncle's hatchet man. He goes out under command.
He's murdering. He's assassinating.
Yeah, he's assassinating people. He's wiping troops out by the 100. He's the big, strong hero type, but seems fairly brainless. Reading up to this point with no prior knowledge of Xiang Yu, I thought, why does this guy have his own biography? He's just running around slaughtering people. And this is the first time he speaks, and it's such a good introduction to the kind of writing Sima Qian does. First of all, it's introduced with the phrase, "The day was cold, a heavy rain was falling, and the soldiers were chilled and starving."
That's such a great scene.
Yeah.
Like, scene setting there. I mean, that's what makes me, when we talk about literature versus history, that kind of thing is the thing that makes me want to go, this is literature, this is Shakespeare, this is, like, just that image of the troops kind of maybe
huddled under their shelters, it's freezing cold, and this one big, strong man walks to the fore in the darkness and says the following thing. And we should point out that this is not a thing in previous writings in China. They don't have...
No, not at all.
If you see something... And you do, for example, see mentions of trees and rivers and bridges and other things in, say, the Zhuangzi, but they're always described for a reason. They're there because the two people are going to talk about the bridge.
Right. And, the previous kind of narrative historical writing, sort of the earliest historical writing is the Zuozhuan.
Right.
And that... The writing, the style in that is so pared down.
Yes.
It's not at all interesting. It actually, the Zuozhuan was originally a series of annals that someone commented on, left commentary on. And so it's just so like bare bones. Mm-hmm. Whereas this, I mean, it's still pretty bare bones by modern standards, but just in those few words, you get this kind of image that's so... evocative.
Yeah. And so far as we can tell from the rest of the Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian, this is something Sima Qian does a lot. He puts a detail in purely for the purpose of enlivening the text.
And I guess for me, I have to ask, does that make it not history? In that it's not, I mean, it's clear that these details are at least not very concerned about the facts. I mean, it may have been raining, it may have been cold.
How do we know, really?
How do we know? How did he know?
Yeah.
We have no way of knowing that he actually knew. But we do know that again and again there are these great images. Mm-hmm. And so that seems more to me like literature. That's the Shakespeare part of this.
And there's this kind of drama all through it. This speech is dramatic.
It's incredibly
This is the moment when Xiang Yu stops being a person in the shadows and steps out to the front and takes control.
And he does that by cutting off someone else's head.
Yeah, which is pretty, we're looking at a collision of the completely bloody and the rational. Because the speech is well-reasoned, which is intriguing. He doesn't just say, you know what, I'm done with this, I want to go fight, and he cuts the guy's head off.
He's actually practicing statecraft, right?
He is practicing statecraft. He's saying, hang on a second, let's think about this. Even if Qin were to fight Zhao, if they win, now they're clearly the ascendant power in the region, and then what weakness is there for us to attack? That's a pretty well-reasoned military point.
Yeah.
And there's also concern showed for the people. Everyone's poor. Our soldiers don't have enough to eat, or they're eating taro root. And it says pulse. I translate it as beans. I don't think they had beans at that point, but beans, I know what beans are. I'm not
it's
sure
something
what
that's
is.
Not really, like, great.
It's not great. They're eating not good food.
Low nutritional value.
Yeah. So he has compassion for his men, or at least recognizes that if you're going to command an army, they have to be well fed, right? And decides on his own, I'm going to take charge and we're going to get this done. And he does.
And he is a take charge kind of guy.
Yeah, he is.
That's the guy. This is the kind of guy you want running your, if I could say, headhunting company.
Yes.
Your
literally headhunting company.
Yes.
And there's the whole sequence of military victories and sometimes setbacks that follow. But to some extent, it all stems from this moment because you have here this collision of the marshal, the military, taking charge with a sword, but also statecraft, shrewdness. He recognizes that it doesn't matter who I am if the people under me are weak and unfed. I'm not going to get anywhere. I have to take care of them too.
He's not. I think you're right. For me, this scene almost embodies the whole Xiang Yu biography in some ways. He's not irrational. He's quite intelligent.
Yes.
But he is rash.
That's a good way to put it.
That's his. If he has a fatal flaw, that's it.
Yeah.
Right?
I would agree. He is rash. That's a good way to put it. And to some extent, it stems all the way back to his opening lessons with his uncle, who was going to teach him to be a commander of 10,000, but he really wasn't able to nail a theory down. Xiang Yu wasn't. And you see that throughout. He is shrewd, but only up to a point. Yeah. So he'll listen to his advisors up to a point. And he'll know what to do, but only up to a point. And his explanation is not, I actually am not, I just don't know what to do sometimes. It is, heaven has abandoned me. Now, as a kind of a postscript to this, Sima Qian frequently puts his own little postscripts on these stories, explaining what we're supposed to get out of them, etc.
So are you adding a postscript to the postscript?
I'm adding a postscript to the postscript, but the postscript to this one is Sima Qian basically saying, okay, so Xiang Yu's whole thing about being abandoned by heaven, yeah, he did that. No way. Like, he just didn't understand what he was talking about, which is weird because, this is one of the great dramatic details in the story. Why does this guy keep getting knocked down? Why does he not just go ahead and take charge of everything? And there's this suspicion that maybe it is bigger than him, but you're not sure. And so that tension is one of the things that drives the story. And at the very end, Sima Qian goes, yeah, no, he was just stupid.
We should point out what happens here at the end.
Yes.
So Xiang Yu dies, and this is not mentioned in his biography, it's not detailed in his biography, but the thing that happens is he's fighting in the end not with the collapsing state of the Qin dynasty, but by the end he's fighting with another guy from the state of Chu, whose name is Liu Bang. Liu Bang eventually goes on to found the Han dynasty, and Liu Bang is the great something or another of Han Wudi, who we mentioned. So we've got Sima Qian here. He's writing about the Han dynasty. He's living under the Han dynasty. So he has to be incredibly careful with how he deals with this foundational thing. I mean, the emperor, for some reason or another, had his cojones cut off just for making him angry.
Right.
So he's messing around with the kind of legitimacy of the dynasty. And he knows how much trouble he can get into with this. So there's something going on here. I don't know what to make of that, but I just want to point that out to the listener.
And it's a good point because I don't know. I mean, how do you know how people in the Han Dynasty or later read this? You could read commentary, but popular reception, who knows? We read it now, and I get to the end of the postscript and think, did you write all this out because you thought he really was abandoned by heaven? Or did you put that in there for dramatic effect and you put this other thing in here to cover your ass to make it look like, well, actually heaven was really on the side of, Xiang Yu's enemies, clearly.
He's clearly just kind of messing with us.
I don't know. How do you know? And another reference, this is not the first time this happens. Not just in Sima Qian, but it occurs in lots of other postscripts.
If we could plug a podcast that we've done, Pusong Ling does this quite often.
Yes.
So he is much more likely to do this, to just mess around with us in the postscript than Sima Qian is.
Yeah. So Sima Qian this is why it's so tricky calling this a history. But the fact is that a lot of what we know about early China comes from this text. If you ask historians, well, how do you know what happened to this person, this dynasty? They'll point you to the Shiji because It's one of the only records, maybe the only record.
For a lot of things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But this is also why early historiography in China is peculiar because, okay, so this is the only record, but like Lee was just mentioning, to introduce a monologue, how would you even know what he said? By saying, the day was cold, a heavy rain was falling, and the soldiers were chilled and starving.
Again, I think it takes us back to Herodotus, right? Herodotus is this figure who's called a historian, the West's first historian, but he's not all that historical. He's writing about he's incorporating mythology into his history. He's not entirely trustworthy. I think maybe we can view Sima Qian that way as well.
Yeah, I would agree. And before we started the podcast, Lee and I were talking about maybe we should go ahead and give our 2 cents worth on the question of whether this is literature or history. And I prefer not even to answer that.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with the Taoist, Zhuangzist. Let's not nail things down.
Let's just. It could be that if someone says this or this, your answer should be yes. No, my plug really is read this. It's a remarkable piece of literature in terms of the drama sewn through the narrative, in terms of how characters are introduced, how they meet their ends, the end of the story itself with Xiang Yu facing down his enemies and slicing his own throat so they don't take his head. That's amazing.
If I could say, just to plug it a little bit more, this is the baddest of the badasses of Chinese history here.
Yes. Yeah.
Read his bio.
I agree. So, any other parting thoughts? Do you want to end with that, Lee?
I think that's my end.
And
now I cut my own head off.
No, the next podcast will be just me. I think, what happened to Lee? Well, he really did do it. His verisimilitude only goes so far, but
yeah. All right. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore,
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.